Thank you. Thank you, Nikolai. Boy, that thing where you win best columnist sounded a lot more impressive when we had more than one at the paper. Seriously, when Gloria said she wanted to have somebody from the newspaper, we knew the reality. Your choices were limited. It was me, Mike Bianchi, or the janitor, and we got rid of the building, so we don't even have the janitor anymore. But I am honored to be here, and it is a distinguished audience. In fact, I realized one little odd thing. I get lots of email and letters, and some of it doesn't call me a douchebag. I really appreciate those, but I don't do a whole lot with much of them, but only 2 times in 20 years of writing a column have I turned my column over to a letter writer, have people sent me things that I thought were prolific, profound enough that I wanted to let them do it, and both of the authors happen to be in this room right now. One is Eric Gray, who wrote about wages inequality and concerns that I shared there, and the other is Justice Charles Wells, who had some thoughts on the integrity of our Attorney General, who I think we thought maybe was lacking in some regards. I appreciate you all having me here. I appreciate your passion for newspapers, but I really appreciate everything that the League of Women Voters does and has done through the years. Your work on fair districts, on voter registration, your willingness to go to court and sue the crumb bums who absolutely traipse all over our Constitution. And we are going to talk about that some today, some of the constitutional issues and also the state of politics and journalism. Frankly, I think both are kind of depressing. But things aren't quite as bad as you might think, or some would say, as it goes to journalism. I thought I'd first tell you just a little bit about my background. As Nicolette mentioned, I grew up in North Carolina. I'm a married father of 2. My wife, Cindy, is a pharmacist with the VA. Today's actually our anniversary, our 26th anniversary. That's, yeah, easy applause line. That's right. She's not here to say the other side of what that relationship looks like. We have 2 kids. Both are adults. One just graduated Flagler College, and the other, our son, might make it through FAU. We're hoping. I grew up in Durham. My father was a lawyer. My mother was a full-time volunteer. It was the 70s, so it was sort of the tailgate of the Watergate era. And when you grew up watching a couple of ink-stained wretches topple a presidency was kind of intoxicating. The idea that just sort of anybody with disheveled shirts and coffee stains on their jacket could influence something, and I got attracted to it. There are a couple of mottos about journalists that have always spoke to me. One is a columnist. A good columnist's job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I like to do the second part of that a lot more than the first part. And the other one is that journalists need to be skeptical. And so in the newsroom, we often say, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. My mother hates that expression, but there's some good value in that. We try to sort of question everything we get. Document, document, document. That's sort of our motto. As a kid, I always knew I wanted to do this. I used to go to my dad's law office. Back in the days, we had mimeograph machines, and I would crank out newspapers that I had made for myself. They were called the Maxwell House News. They had thrilling stories like Scott's dad mows grass, and I would walk around the neighborhood and try to sell them for a nickel a piece. And that was mostly sympathetic buyers. I went to school at UNC, I worked in Winston-Salem, and then in 1998, someone called, an editor, to see if I wanted to cover the campaign of a new guy who was running for what was called county chairman back then. They had just created the position, Mel Martinez. And interestingly, as our career paths have changed, Mel and I sort of live kind of close to each other on opposite sides of Lake Sioux. And I'm not on the lake. I'm like $2 million off the lake, just for the record on that. But I can see it, if you squint right. His house is on my running, which is now more of a jogging route. And I always had a tradition of if I saw somebody's newspaper at the end of the walkway and I was going by, I would just pick it up and walk it up to the front door. And I didn't know it was his house. And I picked it up one day and I walked it up, and wouldn't you know, Mel opens the door in his pajamas, and there he finds the Orlando Sentinel's Metro columnist, delivering his paper. And he said, Scott? And I said, yeah, things have gotten that bad. So that's probably a good intro to get into the depressing part of the newspaper, because I want to get this out of the way right at the beginning. When I came to the Orlando Sentinel, I'm now starting my 25th year, we had 14 news bureaus. We had bureaus in San Juan, Atlanta, Washington, D.C. We had bureaus in every single county, multiple bureaus in every county. There was one in Daytona. There was one in, I can't remember, either DeBary or Deltona. We had bureaus in Seminole County. Joy remembers this. In Altamont Springs, multiple bureaus there. We had multiple bureaus within Orange County. There was a West Orange County. There was even a Winter Park bureau at one point in time. Lake County, Osceola. Today, we have no bureaus. There is one reporter who works at a press center in Tallahassee, so he is technically our bureau chief, but we have none of that. We used to have separate zoned editions for every county had their own. The Seminole Sentinel, the Orange Extra, all those things. We have none of those things anymore. And overall, we had about 300 reporters during our heyday. Today, we have about 50. And in recent years, most of my peers have left. Some of them have been through buyouts and layoffs, but a lot of them have just left for greener, and I do mean greener pastures, because the newspaper business is probably not the most lucrative for the ones who work in it. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And a lot of my peers find that when they go on to other jobs, they find shorter hours, annual raises, and they aren't called turd for brains by politicians most days when they ask legitimate questions. So I guess this leads to the question is, why has the outlook for newspapers changed so much over the past, I'd say really 3 decades? And the number one reason has to do with the internet. And that's probably no surprise to you. And back in the late 90s when the internet came about, I would say that most of America's newspaper owners made a really, really stupid decision. They took a product that nobody could read without paying for. Throughout the history of newspapers, you couldn't read it unless you paid a quarter or subscribed. And they said, hey, we got an idea. Let's put everything we produce online for free and see which one people like more. One newspaper, and it might not surprise you to know which one, thought that was a dumb idea. It was the Wall Street Journal, the people who actually know money. The Wall Street Journal has never put their publication online for free, and for good reason. They say it takes money to produce journalism. It takes money for us to produce journalism, to cover town council meetings, to go to zoning and planning meetings, school boards, airport messes, all of those things. So anyway, when we started giving away news for free, we really raised 2 generations, including my own children's generation, to not put a value on paying for news. Social media would give them what they thought was all they needed in 280 characters. So a lot of people just stopped believing they had an expectation to pay for news. Another thing that's really changed in recent years, and I know most of you are aware of this, is we've become more segregated in our consumption of news. People go to a silo. If you want perspective from the right, maybe you go watch Fox. If you want it from the left, maybe you go to MSNBC. And those are actually pretty tame by modern standards. On the internet, you can find websites and blogs that go all over the place. And what these allow people to do is you don't have to get the news you need. You can get the views you want. And there are a lot of people who like that. There are a lot of people who like to bathe in sort of the warm waters of bias confirmation that is never going to tell them anything they didn't already believe or they didn't want to hear. And one of the problems we run into is that falsehoods are now treated as truths. And I think there used to be a day when people would be ashamed of that. And I think that ship has sailed. And one of the most striking email exchanges I had with a reader, it was several years ago. He sent me, I get emails that are full of nonsense. And this one was chock full of nonsense from start to finish. And I started to send the links to the person to say, every one of your premises here is completely wrong. But before I did that, I sent him a note and I said, hey, before I spend a lot of time giving you the research, the data that will prove your beliefs are not true or inaccurate, let me ask you something. Will it make a difference? And he said, no, save your time. I don't know how we're supposed to permeate sort of that mindset, or how we're supposed to change anybody's mind or come together on difficult issues, whether it's gun control or anything else. So another problem that we've had with newspapers has to do with newspaper ownership. The Tribune was a pretty proud newspaper chain for decades. And then, oh gosh, now I think it was about 15 or 20 years ago, a guy named Sam Zell bought the Tribune. And Sam Zell was obviously a smart guy. He was a billionaire, but he made his money in real estate. And Sam Zell thought that the best way to make newspapers more profitable was to cut the staff and jack up prices. And he took a company that had existed for about a century and drove it promptly into bankruptcy. So the problem is that right now Sam looks good compared to our current owners. I hope none of them are here, by the way. And actually they would not be here because they absolutely do not care. And I think they admit that. The fund that owns us is a hedge fund called Alden. They've been referred to as a vulture fund. And they buy newspapers and they sort of bleed them dry. I'm just being very candid with all of you about this. There is a track record of buying up entire chains of newspapers in California. They're not trying to editorially control. I wrote a column. We ran an editorial, I think, that said something like, please deliver us from Alden. When we were trying to get somebody else to buy us. And I actually I wrote a column saying it was a bad idea, and somebody, I can't remember, Mother Jones, Rolling Stone, called and said, oh my gosh, you were so brave to write about that. And I said, Alden does not care about anything we say. And to their credit, I guess that there's no editorial influence over them. They just care about making money, and that's the problem, sort of the good and the bad of the newspapers, that surprises people. We are still making money, lots of money. We made double-digit profit margins every year, including through the pandemic and every other year. When I knew that our newspaper was up for sale, there were a number of people who expressed interest in buying the Sentinel. I wanted local ownership. I don't normally work on that side of a newspaper. I just write my columns. But if somebody says, hey, I've got $40 million, I'd like to buy you, I'm going to take that lunch at Hillstone, which is actually where I had that lunch. And there was more than one group of people, including one individual, who offered up about $45 million to buy the Orlando Sentinel, which I think was more than we were actually valued at. But Alden and the Tribune folks didn't want it because we're that profitable. And they know that we can keep producing and sending the money to Chicago or New York or wherever else it is and fund their other ventures. The good news is there's no editorial input from them, and I respect that. The problem is there's no investment. And you're not seeing it editorially yet, but I can tell you where we are seeing it, and it's a real problem. We just do not deliver newspapers on a regular basis anymore, and it is humiliating to me. I stopped counting after I got my 800th email, and I went back through my Outlook, from people saying, I'm paying for your newspaper, and it's simply not being delivered. Now, there's a pandemic and there's a labor shortage, but that's just the laws of supply and demand, my friends. You know, if they're saying we can't get people to deliver these papers, that's simply because we're not offering enough money for those people to deliver those papers. That's very simple. If I'm a business guy, I would say I think there's some value in paying people more to get them to deliver the paper to keep that customer base longer. That has not so far been our current ownership's thought. So we are losing subscribers from the print. We're bleeding them. And I can't blame people who are paying and not getting a product delivered for doing so. The flip side is we are really gaining a lot of subscriptions on the internet side. In fact, the Orlando Sentinel in particular is the fastest growing internet-based publication in the whole Tribune chain. And I got one stat, I think I'm allowed to share it. If I'm not, too bad, I'm about to, internally, that I thought was really fascinating, that shows that people are beginning to understand the value of paying for news. Matt Palm does great coverage for us, theater and arts and culture. In fact, we're one of the few papers our size that still has a full-time arts and culture critic. And I give a lot of credit to our editor, Julie Anderson, who's got a lot of, can I say balls? Yeah, she's got a lot of balls and sticking up for things that I write and for believing in journalism. Well, Matt's covered the Fringe Festival for a lot of years, and we put all this stuff behind a paywall, and that means you're not able to read it unless you pay. Last year, Matt wrote something like 75 reviews at the Fringe about the Fringe Festival, and it generated 0 subscriptions. That means that people said, oh, I want to read that. They got to the wall and they go, I don't want to pay for that. This year, in his 1 week alone, Matt's coverage generated 150 subscriptions just from the fringe. And they're able to, yay, Matt. Let's give Matt a round of applause. But I think that represents not only the job that he's doing, but an understanding among the populace that it costs money for journalists to do their job. So I find that somewhat encouraging. And one of the reasons, now I'll move to more of the positive stuff, is why I've stayed. Because I've been tempted. Some of the buyouts have been very generous. I had the last one, I could have gone a year getting paid and not doing anything, which is what a lot of people who read me think they'd rather see me do anyway. But I believe in what we do. And I don't know anyone else who does it the way we do. And I know that we sometimes make a difference. I get to expose shady politicians. I get to highlight worthy nonprofits. I get to spotlight important issues. And at least once a week, I get to hear somebody tell me I have shit for brains. And not every job's going to give you that kind of ability to connect with the populace. But on a serious basis, you probably don't have this much profanity at your Hot Topics normally, do you? I apologize for that. Not really. But it is truly an honor. The trust that I've been able to build with readers is so humbling. I've written columns about a nonprofit and had a guy show up, or actually a guy send a check for $50,000 the very next day to that nonprofit. I had a couple drop off an envelope with $1,000 cash one day in the Sentinel lobby. And the trust that was involved in somebody just leaving that much money, my wife and I had a wonderful cruise. Thank you, couple. No, it was for a mother and daughter who both had cancer and were on hospice when I was writing about them at the time. But that's a relationship and a trust that I value, and I don't think I'd probably be able to get with most anything else I do. So I have sort of accepted my job as a staff member on the Titanic. I'm not good enough to be the captain, but I think I can be one of the string players, doing Nearer My God to Thee as the icy waters rise. So I'm going to stick around for a while because I believe in what we do. Thanks. And I'm going to brag on the paper a little bit because some of the examples that show I know we make a difference. And one of the topics is a topic that would put a lot of people to sleep, but I think this room cares about. It's dark money and ghost candidates. We could do a whole luncheon on the intricacies of this thing. But when this started up in the Senate District 9 race, which is largely in Seminole County, several things caught our attention. One of them was that there was a bunch of ads coming in to Seminole County funded by a group. I think the first one was called for Floridians for Equality and Justice. And these groups are always, they're for, Floridians for rainbows and puppies, for moms and grandmothers, anything to mask the true cause. Well, we wanted to know who was paying for them. So the first thing we did was look up the state records that show where the money came from. And it showed that $249,000, every penny of which came from just listed as a, quote, starting balance. And I remembered my high school biology. There was a term called a biogenesis. It means when life springs out of nowhere. Maybe that can happen from the ooze, the primordial ooze after a meteor strikes. It does not happen with cold, hard cash. You cannot just have $249,000 suddenly appear in a bank. And so there are some things that you can figure, well, there's maybe two sides to the story. We knew that was not correct. Somebody needed to disclose that. Another thing we discovered and that we wrote about, you've seen this in other races, was the candidate. There was an NPA candidate who didn't want to campaign. Did you see when the candidates came up here? They would have knocked down an old lady in a walker to get to that microphone. Right? Judge Chu knows what I'm talking about. Have you ever seen a candidate that didn't want to talk about why they were running or get in front of a free audience? When we got to this ghost candidate, who I don't need to mention, but I will, it's Justine Iannotti. When our reporters got her, she said, no, I don't want to talk about my race. Well, that seemed odd. Seemed even odder when she left for Sweden. And so then we started thinking, well, that's all weird, but we can't prove there's anything, crooked necessarily about that. So one of our, bless her heart, one of our younger, tenacious reporters, Annie Martin, looked at her campaign report and found there were like 6 people who donated anywhere from $100 to $200 to her campaign. And we're all sitting there thinking, why on earth is anybody giving $100 to $200 to a campaign of a candidate who does not want to campaign for the office for which she's running? And so Annie just started knocking on their doors. Annie even knocked on their parents' doors in some cases. And Annie got a lot of doors slammed in her face. But at 2 of the doors, guys answered and said, I never cut that check. I didn't give that. One of them said he'd never even voted before. So now, once again, there's a lot of debates that could be happening on what might be right or what might not be right. But that tells me something wrong went down. Either that guy's lying or somebody filed paperwork that was not true. There's a lot more to go on with this. There was a ghost candidate down in South Florida as well. But we focused on those 2 things, and we wrote about them for years. And we asked the state attorney, why aren't you looking into this race? And the state attorney said, that's not my job. And I said, well, then your job sucks. Because the state attorney down in South Florida did investigation and indicted 2 people, including a former state senator. The state attorney said, maybe I think that's the job of the Elections Commission. So I called the state secretary of state. She said, that's not my job. That'd probably be the FDLE. So we go to the FDLE and say, are you all investigating? He said, I think that would probably be the state attorney. I mean, if buck passing was a sport, we'd have the gold, silver, and bronze with these 3 agencies. But we wrote about it over and over and over again. And finally, at the end of, I think it was spring, the FDLE, maybe out of shame, maybe because they finally thought there was something there, dug into that. And as you may have seen about 3 weeks ago, there was a trio of arrests in that case. I think that was just a start. I think they went for I wrote a column that said that. I think they went just for the lowest hanging fruit. They went for that, I think it was $1,300. I don't believe this much of a coordinated effort takes place for a state senator for $1,300. I think there were a lot of other interests that we've written about. But something happened, and I think maybe if the FDLE does its job, they're going to talk to some of the smaller fish and get to some of the bigger fish. And I'm going to submit that whole thing, that investigation, that criminal probe does not happen without someone like the Orlando Sentinel out there pounding on doors and looking at their stories. And you know, there have been a lot of others through the years. I've been here for a while. Some of you may remember we wrote about the blood bank. We got some pretty decent reform there on inside dealing at that board of directors. We've written about the Expressway Authority. Went through not 1 but 2 grand juries and rounds of indictments with that organization. And finally, and the league helped with this as well, we got reform at the Expressway Authority because the majority of those problems were happening by appointees from a governor that's 250, something like that, miles away. There's no accountability when those political appointees come to a local board. And with the help of advocates like the league and some good legislators, that board is now a majority of locally elected officials. And those people can do bad things. I write about their bad things all the time, but you can bounce their rear ends out of office if they do bad things, and that's the accountability. Compare that to the Orlando International Airport, where it is still a majority of gubernatorial appointees out there. And not all gubernatorial appointees are bad. There is one guy, 1 out of 5, I would add, Craig Mateer, who is being very courageous. I read something about it from this blowhard in the newspaper this morning, if you want to look on page 3, who is speaking up about problems over there. But I think we need more of those kind of reforms. So we've had that. Yeah, that's right. I just blew my whole story about the airport. But that is another story, example, I think, where our drumbeat can make a difference. The first time we wrote about the problems there, a lobbyist who had a background of criminal record, he pled guilty to stealing from the sheriff. I mean, if you're going to steal from anybody, it seems like steal from somebody other than the sheriff, right? Steal from Dick Batchelor. He wouldn't notice, I don't think. He would just bill another 3 hours to somebody, yeah. So this guy's convicted of stealing from the sheriff, and the airport chairman was working to help him get his lobbying business set up. And we wrote and said, Craig Mateer, to his credit, said, I think that's a problem. Buddy Dyer and Jerry Dimming said, I think that's a problem. The other 4 gubernatorial appointees not only said no, they were okay with it, they laughed. One of the appointees wrote a letter to the editor mocking people who had concerns about that. Since that time, that lobbyist who I mentioned has been arrested again as part of that dark money thing that we just talked about. And in today's paper, we revealed that after a public records request, that the airport's general counsel was so concerned about the board chairman's behavior with that lobbyist that he sent an email saying, stop doing what you're doing. You are creating clear conflicts of interest, and you may threaten, jeopardize FAA funding for the airport. Maybe the other 4 appointees are still laughing. I'm going to call and ask. But I think those are the kind of stories that aren't necessarily sexy from the get-go, but that we try to stay focused on. But I have to say, not everything that I write about is that serious. I try to have some fun as well. In fact, one of the columns that I still get people asking me questions about had to do with dog poop. I hope you're all done eating at this point. I didn't realize this was such a debate, but my wife flagged it for me on Nextdoor. There was a raging debate on whether you're allowed to put your dog's poop in somebody else's trash can. And you know what? I get debates over things like abortion and gun rights, but I thought we lived in a civilized society where one of the few understood things was that you cannot take a bag of fecal matter and give it to somebody else who did not ask for said bag. And that's when my wife said, I don't see the big deal. And I learned after 25 years of marriage, I was married to a dog poop person. For whatever it's worth, I try to bridge gaps when it's possible. I've come to the conclusion that the only time it's acceptable for you to put your dog's poop in somebody else's trash can is on trash day when the can is at the end of the driveway. So I will go to my grave taking on that. One of the other things, and once again, please don't be eating, one of the objections I remember from one reader was that if you put it in his trash can on a hot and stormy day, you end up with poop stew. Can't we all agree that we're opposed to poop stew? So most of what I do write about is politics, and I have to tell you that while politics in the state has always been unique, lately that uniqueness has gone on steroids. Rarely a day goes by where the state doesn't make national news, and that's largely in Florida because of one man, Governor Ron DeSantis. He staged press conferences and media events almost every day, and they're always designed to do one thing: attract attention and raise his profile. And he's masterful at it. I've written about that. Truly, he is quite expert at doing this. He gets national, sometimes global attention. But if you look, a lot of the times his press conferences are full of fiery rhetoric, and they're short on details. We're going to cancel Reedy Creek. Who's going to pay for it? That kind of stuff. And this is where it comes back to what we're talking about, the journalism. And this is where I think Florida press corps and modern journalism has sort of fallen short of the job on our job. I don't think we recover these things as responsibly as we should. And I want to give you 2 examples. One day last year, the governor had one of his daily press conferences, the gist of which was supposed to be cops from blue states don't like it up there, and they're all flocking down to Florida. And he had like 5 or 6 officers at a press conference. It was in Polk County. I think it was in Lake County. And the notion was, you know, they don't want to keep you safe up here. We know you want to keep you safe down here. Here's 6 cops that just came to Florida, and that proves that I'm pro-cop and you're safe in this state. And it made headlines all throughout the state. It was pretty simple. Every paper wrote about it. A couple of months later, however, there was one news organization that decided to dive into that a little carefully. And it was a news organization run by students at the University of Florida, something called their Fresh Take program. And they started with the premise was, okay, it's great these 6 cops are here. Let's just check their backgrounds. One of the officers DeSantis spotlighted had been fired from his job as a security guard at a Walmart. Another had been disciplined by the NYPD for interfering with a citizen trying to record other police activity during an incident in Brooklyn. Another had been part of an excessive force lawsuit that New York ended up paying $178,000 to settle. Others had, quote, mysterious gaps in their resumes. Were they all bad cops? Maybe not. But those details cast a really different light on that story that was being told. That story that was parroted throughout the state without really any sort of checks and balances. And it took 19 and 20-year-olds in a journalism program run by a really good professor named Ted Brytus up there to set that story, to get that story out there. And still their follow-up was not covered nearly the way the original story was. So I think that's sloppy journalism, and we should do better. And there's another example that you all may remember. The governor had a press conference in Brevard County, I think it was earlier this year, with a little girl, with the father of a little girl who had Down syndrome. And the father said that his daughter had been involuntarily masked to the point that she could not breathe, that she was actually suffocating, and said it was active child abuse. And then they had Blowhard Randy Fine up there saying he wanted to, was that Anna? I know that laugh. Up there, excuse me, Representative Exumani. Come up there saying maybe there should be criminal charges. Well, sometimes it's great when people get what they ask for. The cops said, okay, we'll investigate this. We have this father, a stepfather actually, at a press conference with the governor, with a state representative, with the state attorney was also at this press conference, alleging child abuse. That seems serious. We should look into it. Well, the cops, I believe it was the Indian Harbor Police Department, did look into it. And I'll tell you what they found. They found that the photos that the stepfather had showed of his supposedly suffocating daughter had been staged. They went to the metadata on the photos to prove that they were taken not on the day where he said they were. They proved that the stepfather had lied to the police. They confirmed that no abuse had taken place. And in fact, the method that the school had used to secure the face mask on the little girl was the method recommended by the Down Syndrome Association. And the other thing that the police department determined was that the family could have opted out. The school had a basic procedure. All you had to do was fill out a form that says my daughter doesn't want to wear a mask, and the family never filled out that form. The cops said there was no abuse that took place. The original story went global. It went in the Daily Mail. It was on Fox. It was in New York Daily News. And when the report came out that said it didn't happen, I know of only two newspapers that wrote about it. One was Florida Today, which covers Indian Harbor, and the other was ours. And I'll be honest with you, I got a little ticked off that day. And so I took it upon myself to write the journalists at the Daily Mail, the New York Daily News, and the Fox News to go, hey, what the hell, man? I saw your first story that said child abuse happened down here. Here, let me give you the police report. Let me know when I can share with my readers your follow-up. You will be shocked to find out that two of those news outlets did not do any follow-up, and one of them did a very short one that was pretty watered down. Those outlets were particularly bad, but all the outlets in Florida that are covering these daily dog and pony shows either need to vet them better before trumpeting the claims or not trumpet them to begin with until they have been able to do so. And that segues into the other vetting I think we need to do better, in which you all are very helpful with at the League, is we have to do, and I know the representatives in the room will appreciate this, we have to do a better job bird dogging the bills that are utterly and blatantly unconstitutional. And there are some things that are debatable. You know, there are a lot of issues in the world that are debatable. Some of the laws we're talking about that were passed during the past two sessions were clearly not constitutional. The big tech censorship bill was clearly not constitutional. If you haven't paid attention to the details, what it basically said, well, the most unconstitutional part was that Twitter and Facebook had to let politicians post whatever they wanted. They had to keep them on their platforms, no matter what they said. I mean that without exception. Child porn, the N-word, libel accusations. These private entities were funding these platforms, but the Florida legislature and governor passed a law that said they could not control them. Even the legislature's own staffers warned them that this was going to be unconstitutional. I'm pretty sure I have this right. It was a judge appointed by Donald Trump who said this law is clearly unconstitutional. They know this stuff. They just don't care. And they don't care when they use your tax dollars to pay lawyers up to $675 an hour, which is information that we got from public records requests that we had to wait months for and go to court for to get. I think newspapers have to do a little bit better job when these laws are first passed, trotted out, vetting them. And another one that you all have been involved with that really steamed my clams was the 2 years ago they tried to put a cap on $3,000 donations. No donation more than $3,000 to amendment drives. Okay? Now, there might be a lot of people in this room, including me, who would like to bring down the influence of money and the amount of money that gets into American politics. But the United States Supreme Court has put a big no-go on that. It's a ruling called Citizens United. They basically equated campaign donations to free speech. I think the court got that wrong, but that's what the court decided. The Florida legislature went ahead and decided with the governor and tried to ban any contributions of more than $3,000, not to their campaigns, not to their political action committees, only to efforts to get citizen amendments on the ballot. So if you wanted to push for things like smaller class sizes, medical marijuana, felons' rights, you could get, and this was in there, you could get imprisoned for cutting a check for more than $3,000. I think a lot of people would expect that kind of stuff in a third world country. Leaders that are trying to imprison citizens donating to amendments. Again, that one was not close. The judge said it was not close. It was wildly unconstitutional and wildly hypocritical. Ron DeSantis has taken donations of up to $5 million at a time from individuals, not in the state, a Chicago hedge fund billionaire. So the idea that he can take that, but you should go to prison or go to jail or get arrested for donating to a class size amendment, that's not okay in my book. So that's, I guess what the question we're left with is what is there for us to do about all this? And one of the things is subscribe to your local newspaper. Good God Almighty, please subscribe to your local newspaper. And I say that sort of seriously, sort of funny, but the other thing we do, I think we all need to do is support good government groups like yours, because you all will go to court, and sometimes that is the only language that politicians understand. The other thing you can do, and I know you all do this more than most groups, is pay attention to the judicial elections. Your circuit and county judge of today is your DCA judge of tomorrow, is your Supreme Court justice of next week. These races are important. It is hard. There's all kinds of rules and regulations on what these guys can say, what they're allowed to say. But we have to pay attention to those races. All right, I want to wrap up because I want to give you guys time for questions. But I did want to give you one last thought on column writing. And that is that I love it, but that it's a lot different from straight news reporting. And in some ways, it's a lot harder. If you do it well, and there's a whole bunch of people who would say I do not do it well. But if you do it well, I would argue that it's harder, and I'll tell you why. Because I hate to break it to most of you and to me, but nobody really cares what any of you think. Everybody has an opinion, right? And if you just tell them what your opinion is, I mean. Let me qualify it by that. Opinions are like rear ends. Everyone has one. Nobody cares unless you can convince people that you've backed it up with a lot of facts. Lots of facts. Probably information they've never heard before. There's a reason I don't tend to write about issues like abortion very often, though I'll probably have to as Roe v. Wade has been overturned. And that's because I don't believe there's a big chunk of people who are sitting on the sidelines on abortion who are waiting for a guy to tell them what they think about that. I think if you bring up, you have to bring up new points. And I think the other thing good opinion writing has to do is it has to indulge the best arguments against the case that you're making. And when I try to write columns, I often, and just to give you an example, the grand jury process. This is controversial among the legal community. I believe the secrecy in the grand jury process has outlived its usefulness. After the process is over anyway. And we don't need to have cameras in a grand jury when it's going on. But when the process is concluded, I believe that that the public should be able to find what evidence was presented to the juries, what evidence prosecutors did not give to those grand juries. I think you should be able to find out what expert witnesses were kept in and out. And the case in point, sort of the best example for us that most people recognize is Jeffrey Epstein's case. I think everybody knows something went wrong in that grand jury down in South Florida that first basically gave him a pass. But you do not have a right to find out what happened, what that prosecutor said to that jury to make them say, he's okay, we're going to just slap him on the wrist on that. But before I wrote that column, I spent way more time reading legal arguments for the secrecy of grand jury. And I tried to acknowledge some of them in the piece and then basically decided, no, I don't agree with that. And the other thing I like to do is sometimes write a full draft of a column and then take it for a walk. Sometimes with my phone, which means I have to watch out for cars. But I think a lot of us, and most certainly including myself, do better when we think a little bit about what we're going to say before we say it. And I often find out that some of the original points I was originally going to say weren't very good. So anyway, I like to challenge my own opinions. I like to hear dissenting opinions. That's one of the reasons I really like newspapers. I believe we're one of the last bastions of providing a myriad of perspectives in the newspaper every day. We're not perfect. We have a little correction section that shows we're not perfect, and we need more perspectives. I'd like to encourage all of you to submit letters to the editor and guest columns. We need good thinking people stuff. But I believe newspapers are still some of the best venues out there for doing so. So that's why I'm still here and why I very much appreciate your interest in newspapers. Okay. And I think we're going to take some questions now.
Okay. Question time. We have 10 minutes and we have 2 rules. You have to be a member, and we want a question, not a commentary. So please come up and ask questions. You must have answered them all.
You can hit hard.
Fantastic talk. Any thoughts on the election police that Ron DeSantis is putting together, and whether it's going to be a Praetorian Guard for the governor?
Yeah, at best, it's political theater. At worst, it's that. I mean, there is real election fraud going on. We've been writing about it. I spent 5 to 10 minutes talking to you about it with the ghost candidates up in Sentinel County. We haven't seen the election police express any interest in that. There have been, how many people in the villages now that have been found out? And, you know, Godspeed to the prosecutor and the police there who've gone after that. That doesn't seem to attract the interest of the state election police. That was largely a solution to a non-problem, and that's probably a generous definition. But yes, it could be empowered. One of the things the governor likes, for better or worse, it's one of the things that people like about him, is he's all about concentrating power. There have been a couple stories just in the past few days, including our former colleague Jason Garcia, who's gone off on his own, who's written about his efforts to consolidate power at the universities and all manner of government. One of the proposals that it hadn't gone forward, but wouldn't even let presidents, university presidents, hire their own faculty. Those hirings would go through the Board of Governors or the Board of Trustees, who are those political appointees that I was talking about earlier. So, yeah, I think it's something to keep an eye on. Yes, sir.
Scott, when it comes to young voters, and you have a focus group in your household of 2 young voters and Florida's future, what 3 topics is it going to take to get them to come to the polls? And lastly, as a past trustee of the First Amendment Foundation, thank you for your support for the sunshine and the First Amendment.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, the First Amendment Foundation is another one of those organizations that is absolutely worth your support. I think Dick's been involved with that before. The First Amendment goes to court to get, most of the time, to get information that is clearly public records, but which politicians and bureaucrats, but usually at the direction of politicians, are hiding. And that takes money and that takes resources. We have, I think at last count, twice sued the DeSantis administration for information that was clearly public records. Both times we've won. Both times they've had to pay our attorney fees. That's a waste of your money for that to happen. But it takes a funded organization like that to do that. So, Charlie, that's really important. And the other thing is I don't have the answer to your other question, so that's why I'm talking really long about the second part. 3 things that youth need to... I got to tell you, I don't know what they care about, and I maybe need to think about that. What I do know, or what I do think I know, is what they don't care about. And boy, the next generation is not as obsessed with culture wars as we are. I will never forget when I was carpooling my daughter, and they were in high school at one point in time, and they had one of their friends who I could tell was transitioning, and I didn't know if what stage in her life her friend was. And I turned around and I said, by the way, I'll make up a name for her. I said, by the way, is Jan a girl or a boy? And the three girls in the back seat looked at each other and they went, we don't know. And then they went back to talking. They didn't care. We care. The adults are obsessed with this stuff. I do think that sort of stuff is driving youth away. But for the issues they care about, I'm going to have to give some more thought to that. Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of caring and not caring, I care about whatever happens to the Matt Gaetz case. And is he going to run again?
Oh, I think even if Matt Gaetz ran from cell block B, he would get reelected in Pensacola. The short answer to that is the feds have really I shouldn't say dragged their feet, that's not the right word. They've been very meticulous with that case. And the reason we all know that is the Joel Greenberg case. Joel Greenberg has copped to those cases, some really serious, bad, gonna go away for a while cases, but he still hasn't been sentenced. And that sentencing has been delayed, I think 3 times, and it's now slated for August, last I checked. I do not know for sure whether the Joel Greenberg case is related to the Matt Gaetz case. I do know that when Joel Greenberg pleaded guilty in court, his lawyer came in front of the courthouse and said, this is a bad day for Matt Gaetz. So one could surmise from that any case involving others is not going to happen until the Joel Greenberg case is settled. But the feds have been very meticulous. But I'll tell you one other thing, though. I think the feds have run their mouth a little too much on the Matt Gaetz. They've been sort of yapping about how and leaking to people that he may go down for a long time. I think it's time for them to stop leaking and start acting, and they have stopped leaking anyway. Yes, ma'am.
So I'd like to know when we're going to hear more about the hundreds of millions of investment of Florida taxpayer money in Russian companies.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to hear more about that. I wrote a column about how, I think it was 2 years ago, China bashing was still the rage to some, and with some justification, I should say. But the CFO of the state of Florida, Jimmy Petronas, sent a letter to every single business owner in Florida asking if they had if they were Chinese owned. He was that interested in finding out the connection between a threatening government and Florida. No one has asked any questions about any business owners or even the investments when it comes to Russia.
I think there was a story, and I'll have to go back and look and see, and it was a reliable source that said that, like, the department, the agency above pension funds, state pension funds,
Right.
had put in a 300
No, we have an investment.
million.
They've just decided not to do anything about it. It's staying there and it's losing value.
Okay, so that much money,
Yeah.
our taxpayers' money,
Yes.
is in Russian.
The argument, if I remember correctly, was that Russian stocks and currency was depreciated so much that if they took it out, they would lose. Last I checked, they've been losing anyway. Yeah.
Just check.
Yes, ma'am.
You've described politics in Florida as a hot mess. If you could do one thing, wave a magic wand and change one thing about the political state of Florida, what would it be?
I think Governor Maxwell would be a... I am kidding about that. You know how some people have skeletons in their closet? Mine are marching down Orange Avenue. There's no way I could do that. I think the two biggest problems, actually, they come back to the same problem. They're money. I believe money, we've been hearing it since the days of the Bible. It is truly the root of all evil. I believe that most people don't go into elected office Wow, that was Freudian. Into elected office because they're evil or awful people. I believe a lot of them have decent intentions, but man, the money controls the process in Tallahassee, certainly at a local level too, but in Tallahassee and in Washington more than anything else, and that money ends up controlling the districts. That's the other thing I would say. The districts are not fairly drawn, as we know. They're better thanks to fair districts, which the League of Women Voters helped pass, but the money controls that. If you want to go to all the things we just talked about with that dark money in that Senate district race, a lot of what it comes back to, or we've traced some connections to, I want to be careful about how I say this, comes back to one company. That was Florida Power and Light. We got a whole cache of secret memos about what they were involved in there. And you start to ask why. Why is Florida Power and Light? Well, because maybe, theoretically, I'm just tossing out theories here, that was a Senate race. The one down in South Florida was a Senate race. The Senate is the one that confirms members of the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission is the one that approves rate hikes and virtually everything else that has to do with utilities. I think money, it needs to be limited, and I go back to the other thing I said before. I think the Supreme Court got that one wrong. Yes. All righty. Thank you for having me today. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Oh, goodness.